Hello, I'd like to welcome you to our December Safe Schools webcast on creating trauma-sensitive schools. My name is Joan Lerman. I'm a school administrative consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. This month's webcast is brought to you with partnerships between the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, the Office of Justice Assistance, Homeland Security Program, Wisconsin Emergency Management, Department of Health Services, and partnering organizations involved in the Center for School, Youth, and Citizen Preparedness. If you're having audio difficulties, make sure the volume is turned up. There's a volume button beneath the speaker's picture. Make sure the volume on the computer is turned up. There's a volume icon located on the right-hand side of your computer taskbar. If you have further problems, contact your IT department. If audio and visual is lost during the program, go back to our DPI website and click on the Student Services Prevention and Wellness Team link on the left. Then when the Student Services Prevention and Wellness Team page of archived programs appear, select the program link desired. If problems continue to persist, contact me, Joan Lerman, at 608-266-2829. This webcast is in two parts. You'll be able to see the program in its entirety, or you can view each one individually. Our presenters today are Elizabeth Hudson and Sarah Daniel. I'd like to introduce Elizabeth now.
Good morning. Well, it's wonderful to be here and to be discussing this topic. As some of you may know, we recently had a conference in which we had a speaker come and talk to teams from around the state who are interested in integrating trauma-informed care into the school system. So the timing is wonderful to be able to speak with you all about creating trauma-sensitive schools. Let me just tell you a bit about my background and how I became interested in doing trauma-informed care within systems, human service systems in particular. My beginning career started in doing domestic violence and sexual assault and the important work around addressing social justice issues as well as the resulting psychological, spiritual, emotional impact. After doing domestic violence and sexual assault work, I then decided that having some more clinical exposure would be important. So worked in a psychotherapy clinic for young children, particularly 8 and under, who were struggling with particularly stressful family environments or had behavioral issues, and many of which had trauma histories. So working with young children is one of my passions. I had also done youth program coordination at a sexual assault service provider agency. So teens, in addition, have been a piece of the work that I have done within trauma services. So I know the importance of the school environment, and I had the privilege to work with many schools in helping kids who were struggling in their communities and in their homes. So I know the important work that you all do and how this could potentially really enhance your understanding and be an important component in creating the kind of classrooms that you're interested in creating with your students. So the PowerPoint that we're going to be using today is actually the creation of a small group of people, and it is one of those testaments to what a small group of people can do when they come together for a short period of time with a great deal of passion. So you will be viewing this PowerPoint, listening to me, and you will also have access to the original PowerPoint on the DPI website within the trauma-sensitive schools section. There's also a couple of other resources. I think that there's speaker notes as well as a question and answer sheet and a great resource form. So let this just be the beginning of information sharing, and the hope and goal is that you would be able to then carry some of these messages back into your own schools. So please do take a look at this list of people, because they have been committed and passionate to bringing you these messages. Obviously, we're not the originators of this concept of trauma-sensitive schools and trauma-informed care. We got a lot of the resources that we'll be talking about from these particular sources, all of which I believe are available online. So I encourage you to take a close look at these, and they will certainly enhance your understanding after you are introduced briefly to these concepts today. So what I'll be doing with my portion of the presentation is really giving the foundation for understanding what Sarah will be talking about in part 2. So I'll be talking about essentially why the practices that Sarah will highlight are so important. And once you understand, I believe, the trauma, the prevalence of trauma, and how it impacts our young people in our communities, I think it helps to provide the motivation to then use some of the implementation skills. One of the things that I think educators become a bit concerned about when they hear about trauma-informed care, creating trauma-specific schools, or trauma-sensitive schools, is, oh, geez, another expectation, another role that I must assume. Now I need to be the therapist to the children that come into my classroom. And that's most certainly not what we're trying to convey with this particular concept. In fact, we're really hoping that these kinds of these application skills, as well as these concepts, help reduce the level of stress in the classroom and actually promote a sense of well-being and competence with staff. We recognize that there is a big difference between what we've understood as therapy and what we want to see happen within the schools. So this slide gives you a little snapshot of how this is different than what you might think of when you think of trauma and the subsequent approaches that have been created to address trauma in people's lives. So traditionally, we really think if somebody's experienced trauma, we want to immediately get them in with a mental health professional who is going to be looking at an intervention that's going to take place typically in a separate building that's one-on-one, maybe group interventions, and is pretty enclosed. And then those folks would then be looking at specific interventions to address symptoms. So that's what we're talking about with more the therapeutic relationship within what we would think of as a traditional clinical environment. When we talk about trauma-sensitive schools, we are looking at how educators can understand what children are bringing into the classroom, the kind of emotional, social, cognitive, spiritual difficulties that they may be having, and how that understanding will then lead to a new way of being in the classroom. So it is not in any way learning things like cognitive behavioral therapy or eye movement desensitization reprocessing, those things we think of as highly clinical. It is really figuring out how to be more sensitive, how to develop accommodations in the classroom, and look at developing some of the core values that we know will lead to a better outcome for many of the children and subsequently their families who've experienced trauma. So it's much more of a culture change and not really looking at specific interventions. So making sure that everybody's on the same page about what we're talking about when we speak of trauma. Much to my surprise and appreciation, there's been a cultural recognition of trauma that I certainly haven't seen in my 20 years of doing this work, and that's quite exciting because it means that our communities are talking about this issue. with that popularization comes sometimes a watering down of what a trauma experience is. So one thing that we really want to make sure we identify is that when people experience trauma, it is something that is usually highly stressful, that overwhelms a person's previous capacity to cope. And it's usually in the face of something that seems life-threatening, threatening to the integrity of the body, and obviously for children, that can be any kind of threat that happens with their caregivers, because their caregivers are their connection to sustenance and life. So this is a very a significant experience. Even with the exposure to a significant experience, that will not necessarily lead to a trauma reaction. There's a lot of mediating and exacerbating factors that can lead to the resulting trauma that is experienced by a child or an adult. So I'm just hoping to complicate the issue just a little bit, because it has become such common parlance to mention trauma. The other thing, I'm just going to forward here. Okay, there's another slide sometimes I use, but I'll focus on what's here in front of me. Another thing that we talk about when we are looking at trauma-sensitive schools or trauma-informed care within multiple environments is a notion of understanding trauma from a new lens. Typically, actually, it was probably in the early 1970s when the veterans came home from the Vietnam War. We had a lot of activism with women who were identifying domestic violence and sexual assault and child abuse. What we really looked at from a research point of view and from an understanding the experience perspective is the concept of acute trauma. So this was something we thought of as having a clear beginning, middle, and an end. It was encapsulated. We could think about it and address that particular situation within a therapeutic environment, and that's where we saw a lot of our common interventions that are used to address trauma within the therapeutic environment. What we've come to understand probably within the last 5 to 10 years is something much more complex, and thus the name complex or developmental trauma disorder. This is something that does not fall neatly within this category of a single event. This is something that we're looking at that typically happens over a period of development during childhood. Not always, but typically. It's usually interpersonal in nature, persistent, prolonged. So, as you can imagine, it has a much greater propensity to impact how a personality is developed, how cognitive understanding is developed, how emotional skills are developed. If you have trauma experiences that are happening during the course of development that are interfering with relationships. So the complex developmental trauma is really what we are looking at when we're talking about the kids that are coming in to our schools and having many issues. Now, one of the things that you might want to think about when you're beginning a discussion about trauma-sensitive schools is, what are the kinds of experiences the kids are having? And here we've got just a list of some of what we would probably see as more common experiences that kids would come into our classrooms with. And, when you look closely at these, many you won't know about. And one of the concepts of trauma-sensitive schools is the recognition that we don't need to know specifically which children have experienced which potentially traumatic exposures. In fact, what we like to call the application of trauma-informed care is using universal precautions. So this is using the approach that we are going to adopt trauma sensitivity for all of our students. We know it's certainly not going to harm any of the students who haven't been exposed to trauma, and it's actually going to make our schools and our classrooms accessible to those kids who have experienced trauma. And I'll tell you a little bit more about accessibility as we move through these slides. So the important point is really to take a moment to consider the many life experiences that the kids and families who join your school community bring each day. Again, we have another, just expanding our concept of many of us, when we think of trauma, we may have specific categories that come to mind that limit our ability to kind of understand the diversity of experiences that can lead people to have traumatic reactions. So we have a list here that will help you consider some of those. One of the foundational pieces of research that we really often discuss when we talk about trauma-informed care is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And I think as each year goes by, a larger group of the national population is exposed to this study because it has been pretty formative in assisting us in developing new policies. So we do like to introduce all of the folks who are coming into trauma-sensitive school understanding to this study. What I want to do is just give you a brief insight into who this study who was involved in this study. It started in about 1997 in San Diego at a place, Kaiser Permanente, a very large HMO in California. And there was a particular physician who was interested in preventative health care. So one of the things that he started to do was to look at how to reduce severe obesity within the folks who were coming into Kaiser Permanente. And he created a very successful weight loss program. What did not please him was that there was a large group of folks who were losing weight and then dropping out of the study. So what he wanted to do was figure out what was going on with that large group of folks who, although successful, did not want to continue on. So he put together a list of questions, not at all having an understanding of what he was looking for, but just trying to get some themes. And in the list of questions, he asked about any kind of childhood experiences of sexual abuse. Well, what he found was a high correlation between the people who had dropped out of this weight loss program and those who had had sexual abuse history. So it got him to think about perhaps the weight loss was interfering with some kind of coping mechanism for the folks who had had this earlier history. And what he did was he really put together about 10 questions, and you've got the categories of questions up here, whether there was substance abuse, divorce, mental illness, domestic violence. You can read through the rest. And what they wanted to do was look for these kinds of categories of abuse within their group of participants. Now, the other thing to recognize within this particular study is it was 17,000 people. So this is a really huge cohort, and that got the attention of the Center for Disease Control. So they thought, you know what, we really want to link up with this particular study and find out more about what the correlations are between these earlier categories of events and subsequent health conditions. One of the things that really surprised them was the prevalence, and here you have a list of these 17,000 people, the percentages of that group that identified these kinds of experiences before the age of 18. What's not up here on the screen is that well over half of the 17,000 had experienced at least one, and a quarter of the population experienced 3 or more of these categories of abuse. So what they started to find with this examination was that when people had been exposed to a category of abuse, and let me be clear, this isn't to say that, you know, if I was sexually abused 5 times a month for 7 years, that would just be one category of abuse. If there was domestic violence in my home that happened, you know, regularly for 10 years, that would just be 2 categories. So again, it's not each exposure, but it's a category. And those categories were within the Center for Disease Control. They started to think about those as doses, trauma doses. And what they saw was that with the increase of each category of abuse, they could correlate that with particular behaviors. Behaviors such as multiple sexual partners, smoking, suicide attempts, dysregulated eating. Things that we would start to consider as potentially being ways to address some of what had happened earlier in our life. Now, if you think about it, if you're going to engage in these sorts of behaviors as a coping strategy, it's going to make sense that you're going to have some health outcomes that are going to result in a need to be involved more in health care, such as depression, COPD, substance use disorders. So what we end up having is a fairly elegant visual representation of what we grow to know as the base of this pyramid as the adverse childhood experiences, those categories that I mentioned, those 10 categories that were examined. And now, with the introduction of new ways of understanding how our neurobiology works, whether it's through, you know, the kind of brain scans, whether it's PET scans or MRIs, whether it's measuring hormonal the hormonal output within the nervous system and within our bodies, we're now recognizing that this leads to, this exposure to these events, in many folks, a disrupted neurodevelopment. Now, when you have this kind of disruption in neurodevelopment, you're going to have some impairments, whether they're social, emotional, or cognitive. When you're living with these types of impairments, it makes sense that you would engage in behaviors to address some of these impairments. And that's where we talk about things like smoking, dysregulated eating, sexual behaviors, indiscriminate sexual behaviors. You are going to try to address those impairments through these activities. Now, when we do that, it makes sense then that subsequently we're going to be facing many social problems, sometimes disease states, disabilities. And this conceptualization, this particular study, the ACE study, and looking at it from this framework, I think helps to bring that element of compassion and understanding to many of the behaviors that before were viewed as either weak-willed or just needing some kind of social support to eliminate or potentially rewards and consequences, with this deeper understanding of how useful many of these behaviors can be to people who are struggling with impairments. It can change the way we view our interactions with folks. There was a study that recently came out in 2010 that looked at the folks who had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences before the age of 18. And unfortunately, what they saw was that those folks, on average, are dying 20 years earlier than people with no adverse childhood experiences. So thus, that brings us to the tip of the pyramid with the early death. So, in summary of the ACE study, it brings us the information with these 17,000 people that ACEs are common within our population, and that they also can be strong predictors of the kind of health risks and disease that we see from childhood, adolescence to adulthood. Many of the people who are introduced to this concept recognize that it leads us to try and figure out better ways to prevent many of these things from happening so that we can start to address some of the leading determinants of our health and social well-being at a much earlier stage. So that gives you a glimpse at the ACE study. And what I will mention is that we have within the state of Wisconsin this year the introduction of the ACE module purchased from the Center for Disease Control in our Wisconsin survey. So by next year we should have some results that will look at how Wisconsin's numbers will fit in with what we know from many of the other ACE studies from across the country. So how does this pertain specifically to school performance? You have a list of some of the outcomes here. Again, just making that correlation that these early experiences before the age of 18 make a significant difference in how our kids are going to be able to engage in the educational process. So more specifically, when we think about trauma, these are kind of the areas that are going to be of most concern in the classroom. So what is happening to this whole child, and we look at these categories, what is happening to this whole child within the classroom environment? Well, most certainly, if you look at this concept of disrupted neurodevelopment, we recognize that there's going to be an impact on relationships. When we're talking about trauma and understanding the notion of complex trauma, we're looking often at what is happening during that attachment period with primary caregivers. And these are some of the elements that we want our kids to experience. They're going to be learning how to regulate their emotions, that kind of self-soothing that comes when a caregiver regularly responds to a child who is crying and helps to promote the sense that there will be assistance in the world when you are suffering. There will be someone there for you. Promoting that sense of trust, and with that trust and safety comes the opportunity to be curious about the world and explore, to experience moderate levels of stress, and to come back and again receive that kind of connection. So relationships obviously are essential to how our children are going to be able to develop and engage in the educational process. And when we look at the typical development versus what happens during a childhood that has these exposures, these disruptive traumatic exposures, we really start to see how the worldview is altered. So instead of having the nurturing and stable attachments, we start to see children that really don't have the sense that there will be someone there that they can trust. In fact, oftentimes within the trauma experience, those folks who have been designated as caregivers are the ones who are actually inflicting some of these experiences. So it certainly does not fall within what we would hope would be that kind of typical exposure to adults in the world. We're going to see that that the world is not a safe place, and that's going to be one of the continuing themes, and Sarah will continue with one of the calls to action in trauma-sensitive schools is what can we do to create that kind of emotional safety and physical safety that can redirect these worldviews, that can start to reconstruct a different view of what the world and people are capable of. So you can read through these two categories of differences, but hopefully when you start to understand what happens within developmental trauma, that's where you can start to figure out, how would I craft my classroom? How would I design my teaching strategies to really allow children who have not experienced what we would think of as a typical developmental experience, how can I make sure that they at least have that in the classroom so that they can begin to alter their worldviews? impact on learning, as I mentioned within that pyramid under disrupted neurodevelopment, we're really recognizing that there will be a new way for us to understand the experience of trauma, and many people are talking about it as a mental injury. So this is a new way to understand the kinds of complications that children are living with. And when we have this understanding of a disrupted neurodevelopment, we are going to then have a new awareness of how challenging the learning process can be for some of these children. And obviously, when you look at this list of elements that go into learning, all of these will be impacted in one way or another by a child who is living in an environment or being continually exposed to high levels of unmanageable stress. These are going to be very challenging developmental markers to achieve. So you might have a child that comes into the classroom that you would expect at the age of 8 to be able to regulate emotions. But what we've found with so many of these children, their exposures to high levels of stress or to these traumatic experiences really alter that ability to bring the regulation. And again, Sarah will talk about, many of these particular categories. There are ways to integrate strategies in the classroom that will build these skills for the children. But what's key to understanding, I think, as an educator, is that when you start to see many of these challenges within that kind of learning capacity, it may raise the question, what has happened to this child? What is going on that is beyond a child who is just being obstinate or oppositional? Could there be something that's really taking place within the neurobiology that's making these things virtually impossible to achieve? Again, we're going to see classroom behaviors. If you have this dysregulated affect, a worldview that's been altered, an inability to engage at the same level as your classmates in the cognitive skills, we obviously are going to see some classroom behaviors that cause a great deal of problem not only for the child and the teacher, but for the classroom. So these are some of the common issues that we will identify. It's usually much easier to recognize the reactivity and impulsivity, aggression, defiance. The ones that oftentimes kind of fly below the radar are the kids who are dealing with their experiences through withdrawal or perfectionism. So we do like to add those just so people are aware that that can also be a response. So I've mentioned a few times this concept of impact on the neurodevelopment, and I have found that talking about this in a very simple way, because that is the only way I can talk about how we are understanding neurodevelopment and how the brain's reacting, can be very helpful to folks like teachers, law enforcement officers, people who just have very frequent engagement with people who experience stress. And so I like to use the model that Dan Siegel presents. He writes on attachment issues and trauma, and I think he's given us this wonderful model of the brain that I use frequently. So what he asks us to do is to think of this as the spinal cord. Think of this as the brain stem. Here we would have the limbic system, and we could just think about this area as the prefrontal cortex. So with this, we have a fairly simple way of understanding what's going on with children who are experiencing a high level of stress or a trauma reaction. So when we think about these experiences that people face where they feel like they're in a great deal of danger, what happens is this limbic system, we're understanding it from an evolutionary point of view. It's a more primitive part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex we don't think is really complete until probably the mid to late 20s. So as we come into the world, these portions of our brain are intact if everything's working well. And the limbic system is going to be that part of our brain that keeps us safe when we are needing to react spontaneously and quickly. We don't need to be thinking in an abstract way. We don't need to bring language to that experience. We just need to be able to react. So what we're finding with children in particular who've been exposed to these situations is that they're living in a state where they're really having to shut down this higher order of thinking in order to function in the world, to just get by, to stay safe. And that when that happens over a long period of time, it alters the neurodevelopment. So it alters these neural connections that are being made in the higher order parts of our brain. So I think that this idea can help us to understand when children are reacting, whether it's, as I mentioned, in defiance or opposition or withdrawing, that oftentimes that is not something that's under their control, that they are really just responding to this kind of fight, flight, or freeze response. Again, this has implications for what we would want to do and create within our school communities to create the level of safety, trust, choice, collaboration that would allow this limbic system, this lower part of the brain, to relax enough to engage with the more executive functioning aspects. So hopefully, and this is just a brief introduction into these concepts, it teased your curiosity enough to seek more information. And this list that you have up here is a great place to start, as well as the list of references that we started with in the beginning. I think that you'll find that Sarah's ability to bring application to how do we actually change our school environments and the way that we approach teaching to accommodate these kids to be enlightening. And I thank you for your time today.
And I'd like to thank Elizabeth for being with us for our Trauma Sensitive Schools Part 1. I think she did a terrific job in helping us to better understand childhood trauma and its effects. If you have any questions regarding this webcast or any suggestions for future school safety topics, please call me, and my phone number and email address are on the slide. All of our Safe Schools webcasts are archived on our DPI media site, and you can view them at a convenient time for yourself. Please join us for our second part with Sarah Daniel on steps to implementing trauma-sensitive practices in the school environment. Thank you for viewing.